the sector. And in order to do so, like I say, it's now a requirement in the code. And if I could just read out the text of the code, just to provide a little bit of context. So requirement 5.2, if you're interested. The board shall ensure that it factors the impacts on stakeholders, wider society and the environment into the decisions it makes and the actions implemented by the organisation. And there's obviously some accompanying commentary that goes along with that. But I was just to kick us off, I was just wondering if we could maybe have some reflections on maybe the presence of a requirement like that in a code, and also the specific wording and what that might mean for organisations in general. Perhaps, Russell, if we could kick off with you, please.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. For me, it's fantastic to see it in there. Mm-hmm. I personally think it was an omission in the first code in 2016, but of course, I would say that. Because this is so important. Sport is impacted by sustainability issues of all sorts, economic, social and environmental, and I know our focus is primarily environmental today. But a lot of the weather impacts that we're seeing, the number of times we see a news report where, even last week in Scotland, it's something like a month's worth of rain fell in 36 hours or whatever, and there were localised flooding. That would have had impacts on individuals' lives in terms of just being able to get around, access to facilities, etc. But it'll have impact on sport. And it's not just rain, it's heat. If you've got a winter where your local football club, rugby club, can't play for 4, 5 weeks, maybe 7, 8, 9 weeks at a time, at what point do people lose interest in playing? If you're playing cricket in the summer, and as we saw last year, I was doing a talk at Gloucestershire County Cricket Club on a Wednesday, and that's relevant in a moment, why it's a Wednesday. And we were talking about temperatures and variability in temperatures. And I said, well, there's a possibility that we may hit 40 degrees at some point, but the Met Office is saying it's really unlikely. So, within the next 5 or 10 years, we may hit 40 degrees. The following Monday, 40.6 degrees. So if you're seeing these unexpected impacts of weather, if you're planning an event and all through the week it's been 28, 29, 30, quite hot, and you've got to manage that, but you wake up on the day of an event and you're hitting 39 or 40 degrees, that's going to impact your sport. Mm-hmm. So we're being impacted by these issues. Now, sport isn't going to be able to confront these issues. These are global issues. These are national governmental type issues. But we've got this huge opportunity to talk about it, put it into our governance systems, but actually talk to our participants, talk to our fans, because then we can amplify that message out. So I'm not talking about sort of manipulating our participants, but use that positive relationship that our participants and fans have with their sport, that positive emotion that they have, and start to introduce some of these issues. So it's into our governance, but it's also into our messaging.
And like you say, the addition into the revised code of this requirement, I don't know if it was a trick of the mind or something, that I thought it was already in the corporate governance code, and I'm not sure, having had a quick look, that it is. It's much more explicit. A similar requirement is much more explicit in the charity governance code. And I think it also chimes pretty well with the sort of section 172 requirements of those who are company directors. But the addition into the code, Jack, would you agree? Positive step in terms of...
Yeah, absolutely. Really positive step, really positive to see it in there and as a consideration for organisations to take. I think, just following on from what Russ has said, this is about good governance, and that's really important, but it's wider than that as well. This is, about the future of our planet. It's about, future generations being able to take part in sport, our future participants, to be able to be here and actually take part in sporting activity. So that's really been, the number one driver for us. The climate impact that we're going to see on tennis, whether it be extreme temperatures on our grass court events, which generate this, significant proportion of our revenue as an organisation, whether it be increased risk of flooding, which we've already seen in recent years impacting our tennis venues. We know that the climate crisis is going to have an impact on tennis at all levels, so it's really important we play our part. We're ready, and we use those channels that we have available to us and the role that we have in terms of influencing, the system in which we operate as well.
Yeah. And maybe Russ, this is one for you, but where would you say the sports sector, I know it's hard to generalise given the breadth of the sector, the difference in the size of organisations, where would you say it is in terms of confronting, tackling, dealing with this issue? Is it ahead of other sectors, behind? Any sense of where it sits?
Sadly, not ahead. I think we're behind, frankly. I think it varies. It does vary a lot. There are certain governing bodies, there are certain clubs, venues that have done a huge amount and have talked about it publicly. There are a lot that are doing things that they're not talking about publicly. They're just kind of getting on with it. It's just the way they operate. I think, in general, the sports sector is possibly sort of 5 or 10 years behind other sectors. It means we can catch up quite quickly because there's a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge out there. But I don't think, sorry, I don't want to be negative because I love the sports sector, but I don't think we really picked up on it as a key issue for us. So yeah, I do think we're behind in terms of the structure. Just the fact that this didn't appear in the Code of Sports Governance until later on. But look, we're kind of there, we are there now. And I think people are engaging in it. Certainly the National Sports Councils, UK Sport, starting to look at this. Other organisations, sort of umbrella organisations within sport are now focusing on this. But we are behind. We need to catch up on that.
Is it curious that we're behind, given how sort of directly that impact can be felt on individuals, participants, athletes, operations? You know, if in other areas of the economy, maybe it's a byproduct. It's something that is happening but doesn't directly impinge on business. Whereas sports sector, particularly the outdoor sports sector,
it's difficult to explain why. I think so. Sport, we don't actually have a tangible physical product. We use products, you know, we use kit and equipment and all sorts of, you know, apparel, all sorts of stuff comes into us as a sector. But largely what we deliver, what sport actually delivers, whether it's recreational participation or whether it's a fan going to Man City or Man United or whatever, they're kind of ephemeral events. So the direct impacts maybe aren't necessarily seen. And I don't just mean in terms of the weather on that particular day. I mean those broader impacts that go into the bigger long-term sustainability issues. So I don't necessarily think it was on people's radar. Most people in sport are incredibly busy, again, whether in professional sport or volunteers in recreational sport. So it never really fell on an individual desk in our different organisations. So I don't think it's not something we should blame ourselves over or, you know, collapse down into a ball and think, why didn't we do this before? You know, the best time to take action is now. And I think we're now aware of this. We're aware that there's going to be impacts on sport, but we've got this massive opportunity to actually talk about it and amplify the messages that we can deliver.
And so, I mean, maybe we could just do a show of hands. Anybody here who has access to their organisation's risk register, does this appear on your organisation's risk register as of today? That's what, 10%, less than 10%? Who thinks it should appear? If it has a direct impact on business going forwards, who thinks it should? I'd say that's still less, half, less than half. Well, maybe there are particular organisational reasons why it doesn't, you know, perhaps if you're an indoor sport, for example, maybe the impact isn't so clear and present. So I think we could assume that you ordinarily wouldn't expect to walk into an organisation and say, can I look at your risk register and see item 4? And
I think that's one of the issues is we've never formally put it onto a risk register. Another issue may be that this is something sciencey and it's a bit difficult and it's tricky and we don't really understand it. We've got no knowledge of it. You know, we know how to deliver events. We know how to coach people. We know how to deliver medals or whatever that might be. But we're not climate scientists. We don't understand climate physics. We don't understand what different polymers can be recycled, so what plastics we should use at our events. Right. So in some ways, it is something that's a bit, or perceived as being a bit difficult, a bit specialised.
But we understand a washed-out event or
exactly,
heat exhaustion of athletes or something like that.
We do, but then make that connection between how we're putting on our event today, and, you know, discussion in the boardroom and a particular decision that we're making about how we're delivering and the global impact of, you know, 33 million people in Pakistan being displaced because of massive floods or you know, similar, smaller scale sort of flood event that happens here. You know, cricket clubs, rugby clubs, tennis clubs were knocked out by various storms that have come through in the last few years. That's for a national governing body to then provide some funds to clean up, to maybe replace a cricket pavilion or a changing rooms or something. Are we linking those individual decisions up to these bigger climate impacts? And like I say, nobody's expecting sport to solve the climate crisis. You know, that's a crazy thought. We can make a small contribution, but it's going to be a significant contribution because so many people are passionate about sport, about playing and watching sport, and a lot of them maybe don't necessarily engage with these issues, so we can use sport as well.
Yeah, well, it's quite often used as a vehicle for lots of
absolutely
social and economic initiatives. But we'll come on to sort of the individual organisation level thinking in a second, but just to stick with the sort of sector level, Jack, I wonder if you have some ideas on, I don't want to put you on the spot, but where the impetus for this change can lie with. Does it lie with NGBs? Does it lie with funding bodies? Does it lie with maybe transnational organisations? You know, like the UN has initiatives geared towards signing up, and I had a quick look at who'd signed up to some of those. So the UN Sports for Climate Change, at a quick glance through, I could see about 24 signatories that looked like they would be UK-based sports organisations, which doesn't sound like all that many really. So any sense of where we are with that and where that lead should come from?
Well, I think, you know, this is everyone's responsibility would be my first and foremost thought. We, as the LTA, are a signatory to the United Nations Sport for Climate Action Framework that, you know, commits us to be part of a wider movement and also commits us to some annual reporting and targets in terms of our carbon emissions. And I think we've certainly found that's been a useful forum so far. You know, is that going to be an appropriate forum for every organisation in the room or every organisation involved in the sports sector? Probably not. But there's some great work now ongoing with the sports councils, with BASIS and others in terms of the Sport and Environment Climate Coalition and bringing together a range of organisations through that to share good practice, to share learnings, to talk to each other, which I think is really important. And then, yeah, as individual organisations, we have a responsibility, I think, to, you know, think about what are our impacts, where do we have an impact, what's our role, where do we have a sort of direct control, where can we influence others that sort of operate within our sports, within our systems. I think that's a responsibility on us as well.
Yeah. Okay. Just sticking with you for a little while longer, thinking again now, bringing it down to individual organisation level, the LTA introduced its environmental sustainability framework earlier this year. So in terms of its genesis, again, predating the code requirement, could you just talk us through some of the motivations behind it and then perhaps talk about the framework itself?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of considerations. I guess number one, what we've already both touched on, but was climate impact on tennis. You know, the fact that temperatures of 40 degrees are going to impact our grass court events, the fact that flooding is going to impact tennis venues across the country. That was probably number one consideration, recognising that threat and the responsibility to act and to mitigate those impacts. I think the second was sort of commercial expectation. Our commercial team, both in terms of the partners that we have already and prospective partners, what's your sustainability policy, what's your approach in this area is increasingly a question that we get asked, and it's expected of us to have an approach. So that's certainly been a key driver as well. I think another important consideration for us was our sort of customer, our delivery partner, our participant expectation. So thinking about the major events that we stage, there's a real expectation from fans that we're seen to act and do more. Thinking about, you know, the 10,000 registered venues that we have across the country, and expectation that we support them as well has been really key. And then from a colleague perspective, you know, the engagement that we do with colleagues, we know this is really important. We know that for younger people in particular, concerns around the climate crisis, around the environment are really important, and probably their biggest concern. So in terms of future recruitment and retention, both of colleagues into the LTA, but people involved in our sport more widely, we identified that as key. And then I guess finally, again, around governance, we it wasn't explicitly a requirement of the code. We probably thought it would be at some point. And we thought there'd be greater regulation, as I'm sure hopefully there will be as we go forward as well, from government on organisations. So really trying to get ahead of that as well.
Yeah, and just reading the framework, so the LTA has at least 3 roles as an organisation. So the organisation itself in its own right, as an event operator, an event owner, and as a national governing body. So could you just tell us sort of in broad terms, so what's involved in the framework, perhaps how it impacts on each of those different hats that the LTA would wear, and what the timelines for those would be?
Yeah, absolutely. So we sort of started the process in development of our environmental sustainability plan last summer, around July, and we published it at the start of June this year. At the outset, we really set out to think about what our sort of role, responsibility within our sport is, and really be clear on that. So, and also within that, thinking about the areas where we have direct control, and that's, our general day-to-day business operations, the facilities we operate at the National Tennis Centre and in Nottingham, the day-to-day stuff we do as a business where we have more direct control through our major events that we stage in the summer that, generate a significant proportion of our revenue, where we're taking tennis to venues that we don't own and operate, so we have to work, collaboratively there. But then the biggest sort of opportunity that we've always identified from our perspective is how we best support, engage, collaborate with tennis in Britain, with the venues that deliver tennis, with the coaches who are sort of out there, delivering activity, with the volunteers who help sort of run our sport, how we best support and engage them. Because in doing so, we know that we'll have a far bigger impact ultimately than through our own operations, but also really important that we are seen and do get our own house in order first. Yeah. So we did, tied to that point, we did some consultation with the wider tennis community, sort of went out to our fans, to our participants, to our venues, as well as our colleagues, to really understand what they wanted to see from us, what support they might like to see, what role they want the LTA to play in this respect. And out of that came sort of 3 priority themes that we're looking to address, which are around climate action, so reducing our emissions and supporting tennis in Britain to do the same, thinking about how we utilise resources more efficiently, reduce wastage, reduce sort of single-use products within our operations, and then finally thinking about the natural environment and the green spaces that many tennis venues around the country sort of occupy, how we play a role in terms of enhancing biodiversity as well. So through all that, we've come up with a plan that sort of has a number of phases. The first is aligned to our sort of current business strategy cycle, which runs through to the end of next year. And that's where the majority of sort of the actions we've identified in our plan sit. And that's really about embedding sustainability into the way that we operate as a business. So thinking about our procurement processes, how we buy stuff, thinking about our business planning, our project initiation and documents and things like that. How do we make sure that we incorporate environmental sustainability considerations into those processes, so that sustainability isn't an add-on, it's not a policy that we've written and sits on the website. It's something that's really very much integrated into the way that we operate, and we really see that as being key. We've taken the approach to not, initially at least, employ a sort of sustainability manager or a head of sustainability. We've brought together a sort of working group across the organisation from various different functions and brought in some external support on specific issues where we need it, because that is important. We don't have that in-house. But in doing so, really hoping that we can really embed sustainability so that everyone feels that it's part of their role, rather than it just being a siloed work stream. And in doing so, really hope that we can embed that thinking over the next couple of years, which is going to take a lot of work, but hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, and that answers actually the question that I was going to ask about where, within an organisation, where prime responsibility for this would lie. So would it lie at sort of board champion? Always slightly sceptical about champions for this, that and the other at board level, but it's a lever that does work. Does it lie there? Do you have a dedicated environmental sustainability or a dedicated ESG committee that sits and can feed into the board? And the other thing, and this maybe speaks to what you were saying, Russ, before about not understanding necessarily the issue, certainly in its scientific terms, but is there a requirement, or not a requirement, but is there a need for training within, maybe at board level, with at staff level, about what the issue is and how we go about tackling it?
There's definitely a need to raise awareness and why this is important. Why is it important to sport? I think it's important to society in general, and we reflect society. The sports sector reflects society. So absolutely, just developing that understanding of why this is relevant and what actions can be taken. And to come, excuse me, to come on the other point and coming back to Jackson, we discussed this before, and I said I'd come back on this one, is around the idea of having a focused sustainability manager, or it's sitting in a particular area, particular department. There's a danger with that it then can become siloed and tucked away. And I was sustainability manager at Lord's Cricket Ground. That's how I kind of got into this. I've got an academic background in environmental sciences, but working in sport, that's where I sat. And I regularly heard, well, that's what Russ does. Sustainability, that's what Russ does. And it can't work like that. You wouldn't do that for EDI. You wouldn't do that for any of the other, discriminatory issues that we've already sort of touched upon this morning. It sits with everybody. It's everybody's responsibility, but there can be a focus for this. So my personal feeling is to have in-house expertise, if you've got that opportunity, does make a lot of sense. You don't sack your finance team just because everybody can use an Excel spreadsheet. So you do need some opportunity to access specialist knowledge around this. And that's more because it does sit with everybody, but it's more because there are nuances to this, and you can think you're doing something good, and in fact, unless you have the whole chain of events put in place. I mean, look, just a simple one, if you're putting on an event and you decide to use biodegradable packaging or something like that, absolutely fine. But do you then have the onward chain to know that that is going to somewhere that can actually deal with that waste? In some circumstances, you are better using single-use plastic, but make sure that you collect it, get it into the proper recycling, etc. So it's having the knowledge as to what is good, what is bad. There are so many products out there that are labelled eco or bio or green or something, and you think, I'll buy that because I'm doing the right thing. And in fact, unless you've got everything else in place, it makes it really difficult. So sorry, that's a slight digression from the point. You can either do this and just integrate it in across everywhere, and I think that's great, LTA are doing that, but if you've got the opportunity to access that specialist knowledge, and at the moment you're kind of bringing that in, there is some need for specialist knowledge to make sure you're not being greenwashed or falling foul to some of these marketing attempts, should I say.
Yeah, and in the session before the break, we spoke about coming at this for the maybe first time or being at a relatively early stage of thinking about this, and the panel then spoke about the quick wins, the things that you can do, and just referring back to an earlier conversation that we had, I think Jack, you said something about essentially it was a thing about not making perfect the enemy of good. Don't expect that you can go all in and have a completely green framework or a completely green operation from the start, but make the wins where you can. And I was just thinking as well, allied to that, what sort of things would you be looking to measure? Maybe using what you've been doing as an example, simple things that you can sort of measure progress against.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the outset as well, we took a bit of time to sort of understand where we actually were in an environmental sense, because there was lots of actually good work that was already going on, thinking about the National Tennis Centre and some of the renovation and other sort of works that had gone on there, thinking about our major events as well, and indeed our participation directorate and some of the support that they already provide to venues, just actually establishing and understanding what was going on across the organisation related to this space was quite important, I think, because actually there was more than probably I would have thought initially. On your point on measurement, a few points, and it links to your point that you're never going to be perfect. We're still understanding to a large degree what we use, what we buy, and really digging into that. I think we've established what our sort of baseline carbon emissions are. That's absolutely not going to be perfect because we could spend years digging into that and understanding the specifics of that. What we've done is establish broadly where we're at, and then over the coming years we'll work to firm some of that data up a little bit more and work out how we bring that down, because that's one of the sort of clear commitments we've set ourselves for a sort of operational net zero target by 2030, which is very ambitious and, you know, it's going to be tough to hit. But we thought that was the appropriate thing to do. So a lot of that data we already had captured through bills, and there's some assumptions that have been made there on spend, which is where we'll have to firm things up. But just trying to understand where you are, you know, at the start, I think is important.
And I think for me, one of the beauties of what you've done, one of the policy you put me right if I'm misrepresenting it, but I feel you've come out, you've been honest with what you've produced, and you've effectively said, we know we're not perfect. We're not waiting for perfection. A number of organisations I've spoken to have said, we don't really want to talk about this because we know we're not doing very well. We are where we are. Every organisation, society is where it is at the moment because of lots of decisions that were made in the past that had good reasons behind them at the time, but we've now realised actually this is having a bad impact. So nobody's to blame for those things necessarily. You know, we can talk about that and maybe specifics or whatever. But in general, sport reflects society. We're in a situation where we're quite wasteful, generally, whether that's energy, whether that's materials. So there shouldn't be any level of embarrassment or shame or hiding away and saying we can't talk about it because, you know, we're doing something here, but actually we're quite bad on this side. Just actually try and be honest about this, try and take a strong position. I think a good starting point, yes, absolutely the measurement side of things, and the obvious ones are looking at energy use and carbon emissions, looking at waste, looking at your procurement policies, and do you actually ask any kind of questions to your suppliers about sustainability issues? And frankly, you will be surprised on two levels, your suppliers and your sponsors. If you initiate that conversation, you'll be surprised how many come back and actually say, yeah, we're doing quite a lot, and frankly, we're relieved that you've asked us, because now we can talk about it and we can do something together. So I think, you know, that there are opportunities just around having these conversations, initiating these conversations, taking it forward.
Actually, I'll open the floor to questions in a second, but just on your point about a wasteful society, we've got a question just come through on the app that says, sport can be... as sport participation increases, this increases food consumption and sport-specific clothing purchases, both of which have a large carbon footprint. Does the panel have a view on sport's impact on the climate rather than climate's impact on sport?
Yes, we have a big impact on the climate, absolutely. We're purchasing products that create greenhouse gas emissions. Our operations will create greenhouse gas emissions. The most sustainable event you can put on is the one that you never do, which is a crazy thing to say. And nobody's advocating that. You know, nobody in this sustainability area is saying we shouldn't put on these events. We've got to mitigate it. I mean, one of the things in the wording of possibly in the wording of the code is it does say to ensure sport operates in a sustainable way. I would insert the word more in there. A more sustainable way. We're always going to have impacts. If you're a professional venue, if you're bringing 30, 40, 50,000 people to one point in space and time, there's going to be impacts associated with that. But there are social and there are economic benefits as well. So you've got to balance these, reduce those environmental impacts as much as we possibly can. Don't necessarily increase the number of events we're putting on, but absolutely look at how you're performing in terms of those events, what your footprints are. So yes, a huge amount we can do. The other absolutely key thing to remember, again, I've said this in a slightly different context, but sport isn't going to solve this problem by itself. If we're talking about transport to get to events, then we're talking to local authorities, we're talking to the manufacturers of, you know, electric vehicles, etc. We don't do this in isolation, but we've got to participate with other organisations and open that conversation. Sport opens the door to many conversations because a large proportion of people in the country have some level of interest or participation. So we can be part of that solution, but we don't do it in isolation.
That's right, thank you. And anybody, so we've got about 5 minutes for questions. We're about 5 minutes off the programme at the moment. So if we do have, Yep, got 1, 2.
Hi, yeah, it's not a question directly, but just to flag an opportunity for a dialogue about environmental sustainability. Sport England, Sport Wales and Sport Scotland are embarking on a joint piece of work to do some mapping and understanding around our partners' engagement with environmental sustainability and climate change, finding out what your thoughts are, where you're up to, what you think your challenges are, barriers, what's the role that you want your sports council to play, what help and support do you need. So keep your eyes peeled. There will be various communications coming out. It probably will be after Christmas now, given that we're technically in the run-up to Christmas holidays. So yeah, just keep your eyes peeled for an opportunity to take part in that consultation, because we really want to hear your thoughts, how you can be supported from a governance point of view on environmental sustainability and climate change, but also more broadly than that. Thanks.
Yep, thank you. And yep.
Thank you. I'm Will from British Triathlon. I'm head of clubs and regions, but have played a role in our developing sustainability strategy, which we'll launch soon. The fact that I'm head of clubs and regions ties into a bit what you were saying, Jack. I'm a well-meaning idiot in this context and in many others. I guess the biggest challenge we're seeing is we've got what we think is an ambitious strategy. How the hell do we resource it? And in a cost of living crisis, which is squeezing budgets across the board, the risk is that sustainability falls down the list and stays at the bottom of the list. My day job will take precedent because my boss will make sure it does. We're in a similar position to you, Jack, where we have a well-meaning committee internally, but nobody whose role this is. And I guess some of the point there around sports councils and how do we fund these roles, how do we make a commitment to sustainability within funding cycles, but equally a question to the panel of, are there ways currently that we are able to access funds to resource and elevate the importance of sustainability in organisations?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll give you maybe possibly an answer that you didn't necessarily want in terms of, I don't know, in terms of accessing funds, I don't know directly. One thing that I do want to say though that is, I promise, related to that question, and I hope sort of reassures some people who are thinking, how do we actually do this? I don't think you need to do anything different necessarily. There will be projects that need separate funding and need appropriate resourcing. But your organisations will be, you'll have travel and transport policies, you'll have stuff when you're putting on events, you know, you'll be contracting in different organisations, whether for catering, for cleaning, or all those kind of things. The first thing that you can do, I've already alluded to, is have a conversation with these people. You don't need to do anything different. Nobody is necessarily telling you to do something completely separate and set up a sustainability department and throw lots of resources at it. But just look at the way you are operating at the moment and see where those impacts could be. Now, it might be you need some awareness training and understanding just to see where those touch points actually are. But the first thing to do is actually just look internally and say, well, where might we be having impacts? Where are the key elements? And I think, LT, I think you've done this with that structure in terms of your own internal operations, where you can influence in terms of your events, and then the broader influence. So sorry, well, that doesn't answer your question directly in terms of your particular area, but maybe someone else can. So, you know, I do think in terms of funding, ultimately this ought to be a requirement from the funding bodies, not exclusively and not necessarily that if you're not doing it you won't get funding, but it could enhance funding. It could promote a bit more, maybe it's a few extra points if you're saying you've got these projects in place. So funding is needed, but you don't have to have large amounts of money to just look at what you're already doing and how you can tweak that, how you can change it.
Just to follow on from that as well, I guess we have, you know, largely, principally resourced the work that we've done very much in-house. We've, you know, spent some money in bringing some external support in, but there's a lot that you can learn from what other organisations are doing, and I think there's a really big opportunity as we all grapple with this issue in the coming years to learn from each other, to share good practice, because we're all going to be grappling with the same sorts of issues. And I think there's going to be a number of different forums through which we can do that, and some support from the sports councils hopefully as well. But I think there is information out there. You know, there's Basis as an organisation who've got some expertise that people can join. There's, you know, other organisations who are a bit more advanced that we certainly learn from as well. So I think there is information and resource out there to help with the journey too.
Okay, that's great. And then just one final question down here, please.
Jason Wiltshire from England Hockey. Not sure if people can hear. Russell, I agree with you. I think it's, I'm trying not to be negative, I think it's slightly depressing. And I think it's just a couple of comments really. I think sort of when you look around, I have a slight worry that some of this is window dressing. There's certainly not enough conversation going on in this space, and I commend the LTA for doing that. I think you only have to look at the World Cup at the moment, and then you look at skiing and, you know, Russia, Beijing, Sochi. This desire from international federations to take the sport to places where, you know, to expand the sport. But what is it? Is it the pursuit of profit? But I do just worry sometimes that, you know, sports may be talking about this, but then the optics of what you can see, you look at Qatar and it's just a disaster. You then look at, you know, there's a cycling team in the Ineos Grenadiers that name themselves after an expensive gas-guzzling 4x4. You know, cycling, I'm not picking on cycling, but to partner with Shell. And I worry about whether we look at the partnerships. That's not really been mentioned, but, you know, I'm sure NGBs can control things like number of training camps they send people and whether they do that abroad or whether they keep it in-house and look at the carbon footprint. But the optics around who we're using, you know, if we're using companies, you know, sports companies say, you know, does Nike have the same profile as someone like Patagonia? Clearly it doesn't. You know, they're more akin to fast fashion than sustainable, you know, sustainable sort of produce. So I just worry about it. I think the conversations do need to happen, but when I look around and you know, you see Qatar, you see Shell partnership with British Cycling, and I don't know, are things being spoken about enough? And I get the point also about being scientific. I think that's a bit of a red herring. I think there's enough information out there that will inform people, and it doesn't have to be a deep dive into the science of it, because some of this stuff is really easy to digest and really palatable. But I just worry we'll be talking about it again. We might have a few more NGBs that have done what the LTA have done in 5 or 10 years, but will we have moved anywhere? You know, will we have moved forward at all, or will athletes still be wearing kit from unethical manufacturers? And if you look into the carbon footprint of the sport industry and sports retail as a whole, you've alluded to it, it's a disaster. So I think there are easy wins here where sports can inform their event organisers around some of this. I'm not sure resourcing it is again a big problem. I think you can do some easy comms around this and just cascade information that's already out there just out to the wider sports community who are not thinking about this sort of stuff.
Okay, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to respond. I think we're just a little pressed for time.
Yeah, I will just respond and say you kicked that off by saying sometimes you feel it's a little bit depressing, and frankly some mornings I wake up and say, why am I bothering? What's actually going on? You know, you see certain things. So I agree with everything that you say, and there is definitely the possibility that some of this is just a thin green veneer being pasted over the top. It's why it's got to be a genuine conversation. And I honestly think that LTA have done this. England Golf, a few other organisations have actually genuinely looked at this and said, we're not perfect at the moment. We don't know quite how we're going to get there, but it's something that we really want to look at. And I think that's the sort of approach we need to take. We are early in this journey in terms of sport, but there is expertise out there, there's knowledge out there. Yes, there's still a huge, you know, a lot of elite sport is a business, so it is only about making that money, and it's about expanding into new markets and all the rest of it. We've just got to reflect on that and see the damage that is actually occurring and the impacts that are going to happen to sport, and the genuine sort of grassroots recreational sport needs to take this on board, and we respond to it. And like I say, we're not in isolation. Sport isn't isolated in this. There are so many big companies around the world that are frankly greenwashing around these issues. So yes, sorry it's not a comprehensive answer, but I know we're short, but very happy to talk to people on this as well.
Can I just pick up on one point there, because I think it's an important one as well, tied to elite sport, is actually thinking about the reach that we have as sport and the elite athletes that we support, that we engage with, and that's something we're very much thinking about and going to be doing next year, engaging with our top British players to ask them, you know, what they think, how we can best support them, but B, encourage them to think about the way in which they operate. You know, can they plan their travel around the world more effectively, and ultimately think about the voice and the reach that they have as individuals in terms of engaging a far wider audience, because that's where the points that you raise around commercial partnerships, that when you've got athletes talking about this and being confident and talking publicly and making statements, that will help to influence change, I think, in the sector as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, yeah, I think the point is we are going to be talking about it, hopefully productive talking about it, because I think it's something that we are all going to have to grapple with, organisations and individuals. So it's absolutely right that we have these conversations, but hopefully there will be productive ones. Thank you, Russ. Thank you, Jack. A really fascinating session.